Okay, welcome all at the weekly TCS seminar at Jagiellonian University. Today, our speaker is Pat Morin from Carleton University. Pat, together with a group of co-authors, just announced an exciting result, a solution of the variant of the Hadwiger conjecture for the cluster coloring. This is a topic that was heavily studied, especially there was some kind of acceleration over last couple of years, and we are very happy to see and witness a conclusion today. Thank you, Pat, for coming, agreeing to share the news with us, and please take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Piotr, for having me, as well as the other organizers. So on this title slide, what you see here is a couple of things. One is a picture of the city of Grenoble from the top of the Bastille. And that's because this is where I was for the last 3 months on sabbatical. Vita was there as well, and it's where Louis works. And David had to participate remotely from Australia. And then the other picture that you see here is a picture of a curtain in a theater. And just a couple of things about that. This is a particularly fancy curtain. It has lots of sheets in it, lots of separate drapes. All of those things are stitched together at the top of the curtain, but otherwise they're kind of separate. And if you been to the theater before, probably most of you have, the way things start is someone raises the curtain, a show takes place, some exciting things happen on stage, and then at the end of the process, someone lowers the curtain. And if the audience is not particularly happy with the things that happened on stage, they may throw some rotten tomatoes or other variety of colorful fruit at the curtain. So remember those things. Okay, so this talk is about a variant of Hadwiger's conjecture. So the original conjecture is a very precise statement. It says that every KH minor free graph has a proper H-1 coloring. So what do some of these words mean? Well, KH is the complete graph on H vertices. A graph contains another graph as a minor if you can find a subgraph in there, contract edges in that subgraph and obtain the other one. So KH minor free means you cannot find a complete graph on H vertices as a minor, so you can't find a subgraph that you can contract to make a complete graph on H vertices. And H-1 coloring is a coloring of the vertices with H-1 colors, and proper means that that each edge gets 2 different colored vertices at its endpoints. So for H equals 3, K3 minor free graphs are simply those graphs without cycles. So those are forests, their components are trees, and those are 2 colorable. So the conjecture holds there. For H equals 4, the graphs you get are partial 2 trees, and those are also 2 colorable just by the standard inductive coloring, or 3 colorable rather, by the standard inductive coloring. And for H equals 5, well, one thing you may recognize is, well, that talks about K5. K5 is sort of one of the classic examples of a non-planar graph. So we know, for instance, that planar graphs will not have K5 minors, and the conjecture asserts that such graphs are 4-colorable. So in particular, it implies the 4-color theorem for planar graphs. This is a sign that it's not going to be easy if already for H equals 5, it implies the 4-color theorem. Okay, so there's been a fair bit of progress on Hadwiger's conjecture in the last few years. So I guess originally there's a degeneracy argument that basically says KH minor free graphs have degeneracy H square root of log H. And that immediately gives an inductive coloring of these graphs with that many colors. And that's optimal if you're looking for degeneracy. Very recently, though, so there's been a sort of couple of breakthroughs. So H polylog H, in fact, H log H to the quarter, so quarter is less than a half, came from Morin, Postel, and Song. H log H to the 18, that lasted for a few minutes, and then basically was replaced with a result of Delcourt and Postel using O of H log H colors. So so not quite a linear number of colors, and definitely not the very precise statement of H minus 1 colors that the conjecture asks for. So here's another variant on the conjecture that is, if you, let's say, want to be strict with the number of colors, but maybe not be so strict with the coloring, so not require that it be proper. So the clustered Hadwiger conjecture says that every KH minor free graph has an H minus 1 coloring in which each cluster has bounded size. So what's a cluster? Well, a cluster is just a monochromatic component. So these would be the components induced by each color class. So that those components should have bounded size. And what do I mean by bounded size? I mean that they should be bounded by some function that has nothing to do with the graph. In particular, it's just a function that depends only on H. So for instance, the original Hadwiger conjecture says that there's a clustered coloring where each cluster has size 1. So that would be great. We're going to settle for clusters of bounded size. And just to be concrete, here's a picture of a graph. It is colored with 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And if you look at the clusters, some of them have size 2, the largest ones. So this is 3 coloring with clusters of size at most 2. And again, as Piotr pointed out, there's been recent progress on these on this sort of problem. In 2007, there was an upper bound of 15.5H by Kawarabayashi and Mohar. That got optimized to a 3.5H by Wood, and then upped to 4H, not because there was something wrong, but because there was part of that proof relied on an unpublished result. So 4H was still interesting. And then down to 3H, down to 2H. And here we're going to prove that H minus 1 colors is sufficient. And that's actually optimal. So no matter what size of clusters you're willing to accept, if you want them to be finite, you need H minus 1 colors at least. And there's a little star here beside this thing, because in 2017, Dvorak and Morin announced that in a forthcoming paper, they would prove this result, in fact, a stronger result, choosability. But as far as I know, that paper has not been written yet. So so here's a proof that is written, and you can see today. Some of the proof techniques we'll use, the graph minor structure theorem of Robertson and Seymour is going to be there. In particular, a sort of precise version due to Dvorak and Thomas is the one that we're going to use. There, the important thing is the so-called major apex vertices. We really need to understand those. We're going to use some results about clustered coloring of bounded tree width graphs that also have excluded subgraphs or excluded minors. Those are due to Liu and Wood. We'll use islands in embedded graphs. Those were introduced by Espera and Ockham, But the particular version we're going to use is due to Dvorak and Morin in this paper in which they announced the upcoming result. And of course, if you know the authors of this paper, you won't be surprised to see that we'll also be using so-called product structure for embedded graphs, and in particular the layered partitions version of product structure. Okay. So there's a few pieces moving around, and I won't necessarily present them in order. So this slide will come up a few times as we see these pieces. So the first thing we're going to do is define something called a tree of curtains, which is really just another view of the Robertson-Seymour decomposition. Second step will be to remove some islands in individual curtains and near the bottoms of the curtains in the lower layers. Then the show starts. We raise the curtain. We do a bit more work to remove some particular subgraphs in the raised curtains. These are complete bipartite graphs with 2 vertices on one side of the partition and lots of vertices on the other side. We'll get rid of those. Then we'll use the bounded tree width results that I mentioned of Liu and Wood on those raised curtains. And then finally, we'll lower the curtains. The audience won't like what they see when we lower the curtains, and so they will throw some tomatoes at them to decorate them a bit more and maybe fix any problems. Okay. So some of you, in fact, I know some of you were at the Banff workshop on product structure in November 2021. And there, Vida Dujmovic, my co-author, gave a talk about apex minor free, KST subgraph free graphs and clustered coloring of those. And so if you saw that talk, some of these things will be familiar. In fact, we'll be using many of the ingredients there, plus a couple more tricks. So in particular, the tree of curtains, this idea of raising the curtain, using the bounded tree width result on the raised curtain, and then lowering the curtain and throwing tomatoes, or if you like, using breaker colors to break up large clusters. All of those things appeared there. There's just a couple of new ideas and extensions to those existing ideas. Okay. So if we're going to talk about Robertson-Seymour decomposition, so the graph minor structure theorem, I need to talk about almost embedded graphs. And for us, we'll have 2 parameters for our almost embedded graphs, A and L. So to get one of these things, you start with a graph that is drawn on a surface with no crossings among the edges, and the surface should have some bounded genus. So genus G, which is not more than this second parameter L. And then you pick on this graph what are called clean disks. So this graph is called G0. You pick what are called clean disks. These are just disks that don't touch any edges of your embedded graph, but they may have some vertices on the boundary, and the disks themselves are disjoint. In those disks, using the vertices that are on the boundary, you create these things called vortices. These are graphs that have small path width, and even more than that, they have a particular type of path decomposition that has to do with the order things are touched. Important thing for us is that they have bounded path width, so let's say also bounded by L, and there's not too many of them. There's also at most L of those things. So don't think of the edges of these things as being in the surface anymore. They are not in the surface. If they were, they might have to cross each other. So they're not an embedded part of this graph. Think of them as above the surface. On top of that, you add what are called minor apices, or if you don't like the word minor because it's used for other reasons, They're non-major apices. There's L of those. And those are vertices that sit really outside this whole embedding. They can connect to any of the vortex vertices that they want. So some of those vortex vertices may be on the surface. Some of them may be interior to the vortices. These minor apices, they can do connect to any of those that they want. Again, there's a bounded number. The number is at most L. And then the really problematic thing is what are called major apices. And for these, we really care about the number of them, and we call that A. That's the leading parameter in this almost embedding. And they're problematic because they can connect to any other vertex of the graph. So they can connect to minor apices, they can connect to vortices, but most importantly and most problematic is they can connect to anything down on the surface, far away from vortices. Okay, so those all of those sort of non-embedded things, and in fact, even the embedded things which are on the boundaries of the vortices, we'll call that the top of the embedded graph. And I'll typically draw them so they're near the top. And adjacent on the surface to those vortices are some other things. We'll call those the union of those two things the near top. So all the vertices that are in the top plus anything which is adjacent to those on the surface. So that does not mean that things which are adjacent to the major apices are near the top. It's really the adjacency has to be within the surface. Okay, any questions? Okay, and two parameters, A is the number of major apices, and L is sort of a catch-all. Should be bounded, but it can be big. A we really care about. So the graph minor structure theorem says that if your graph is KH minor free, then it has a tree decomposition such that each torso is one of these almost embeddable graphs. Let's say LL, almost embeddable. For some L that depends only on H. And so what does that mean? Well, what's a tree decomposition? Well, that's a tree where you think of the nodes of the tree as being these almost embeddable graphs. And when two nodes share an edge, there's a set of vertices in one of those graphs, which is identified with a set of vertices in the other one. So for example, in this picture, there is orange, red, and purple vertex, which appears in this upper graph and in this lower graph. And so you imagine that those things are identified. They're actually the same vertices. And this word torso appears. That just means it's the graph that is obtained by, on all of these things are called adhesion sets, the vertices that are common to the two endpoints of an edge. These adhesion sets are always forming cliques in the torso, even if all the edges of that clique were not actually present in the graph that we're interested in. Okay, and it's important that the torso is the thing that's almost embeddable. So you can't just do adhesions on arbitrarily large cliques, because then you might not have something that's almost embeddable. Okay, so that's the graph minor structure theorem. But I said we're interested in a special version of this thing, and it's the Dvorak-Thomas version. And in that version, there's a very precise bound on the number of major apex vertices. Remember, these are the ones that connect to anything. There's at most H minus 5 of those. Okay, so that's an important thing that you can read right off of their theorem. And what you can derive from their theorem statement, it's certainly not expressed this way, is the following: that anytime you have an edge in your tree decomposition from a parent Y to a child X, then that clique that they're identifying, it's in the top of X. So it belongs to the set of vortices, minor apices, and major apices. So it's always in the top of X. And then one of two things happens. Either that clique is small, it has size at most H minus 2, or it's completely contained in the near top of Y. Okay. So in this tree decomposition, there's two kinds of edges. There's the light ones, they only have size H minus 2. There's the heavy ones, and the heavy ones, they're both in the top of X and near the top of Y. Okay, so this is the picture here. Case 1, there's a small number of vertices that are common to these both X and Y. They're always in the top of X, that they could be sort of anywhere in Y, but it's a small number. So for example, you might have 3 down in the surface part of Y and 2 major apices there. So that's the case 1, the light case. Or it's a big clique sum, bigger than H minus 2, in which case I can tell you that they're still also all in the top of X, and they're almost in the top of Y. They're in the near top of Y. So they're either in the top or they neighbor vertices of the top by edges on the surface. Okay. All right. So now if you look at your tree decomposition, you can classify the edges as one of those two types, type 1 or type 2. And you can imagine, let's say, removing the type 1 edges, or imagine that the type 1 edges break this thing up into a little forest of subtrees. And the components of that forest, those things are called curtains. So we'll call those things curtains. This thing is called a tree of curtains. Okay? So the point is, within a curtain, all of those edges are of type 2, meaning that the torsos there are glued together using vertices near the top of both torsos. That's where the term curtain comes from. The stitching always happens near the top of both of these things. So that's the tree of curtains. In this picture, there would be 4 nodes in this tree, just a root curtain that has 3 sheets or drapes in it, and then 3 child curtains, which each have only one sheet in them. Right. So this is that gives you the definition of one of these curtains. It's called a KL curtain. K corresponds to the number of major apices. L captures all of those other things. And the point is that in a curtain like this, all of the adhesions happen at the top of everything. And so you can imagine that actually, even if this is a big tree, you can just imagine that the tops all line up and you glue them all together all at once. So there's no issue there. That's the way you should think about this thing. So I don't know, here's an example, and I will start drawing these things like this. Those 3 nodes in the tree decomposition become 3 drapes or sheets in this curtain. Okay, questions yet? No, good. All right, so just to summarize, or not to summarize, but zoom in on one of those curtains. It's made up of individual drapes. An individual drape has a bunch of major apices, at most K of them. It has a bunch of other non-embedded stuff in the top, and then it has another, let's say, layer of things that are adjacent to that non-embedded stuff down in the surface. But after that, it's all surface. It's all embedded things in the surface. So once you get away from the top, everything is embedded in the surface. Okay, so here's the theorem, but I've kind of just explained the theorem that every KH minor free graph is a tree of H minus 5 L curtains, where L only depends on H. So you just take the tree decomposition, you classify its edges as type 1 or type 2. The type 1 edges tell you the shape of the tree, and the type 2 edges, they are the things that form the parts of the individual curtains in this this decomposition. Okay. So from that, we can already, using this tree of curtains, we can already do a big part of the coloring just using a top-down algorithm. So you start at the root of this tree of curtains. You color all of the vertices that are in this this root curtain. That's what we're going to have to show how to do, but at least this is something a little bit different. You color all of those things, and once you're done with the root, you color its children and so on. Let's say in a BFS order or DFS order. The important thing is you color a curtain's parent before you color it. And now when it's time to color one of these things that's not the root, well, some of its vertices are shared with its parent. Its parent has already been colored, and so some of its vertices are already pre-colored. And we know how many there are. It's because this is they're not in the same curtain. That means that the clique sum or the edge of the adhesion set that those two things have in common has size at most H minus 2. And not only that, we know that those H minus 2 vertices, they live in the top of the thing we're about to color. So our real subproblem is you have a curtain, there's H minus 2 vertices in the top of the curtain that have already been colored, and you want to extend it. And you want to extend it in such a way that any monochromatic component that was growing in the parent should stop there. It should not bleed down into this thing that we're continuing to color. So you call that you say that the coloring is proper with respect to the pre-colored vertices, meaning that the neighbors of the pre-colored vertices will all receive different colors than their pre-colored neighbors. So this is the picture here, right? There's the parent curtain up top that someone has already colored for us. Then there's the vertices and the clique sum, red, green, and blue here, red, green, and blue. And we're going to extend this coloring so that the neighbors of those three pre-colored things are proper with respect to their pre-colored things. So that doesn't mean we can't use the colors red, green, and blue, but it does mean that if we have a red pre-colored vertex, we cannot color one of its neighbors red. We could color it blue or green, and so on. And, as you can see that if you do this, then the green component, which was growing in the top, stops there. It does not extend down into this child curtain. So really, it's good divide and conquer. We can focus entirely now on just dealing with one curtain that has annoyingly a few pre-colored vertices, but that turns out to be not so annoying. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now you know what the tree of curtains is, and you know that actually it all boils down to just dealing with a curtain that has some pre-colored vertices. All right, so before we do the whole thing, let's just make a first try. Let's see if we can get something close to the right answer using just the ideas we've seen so far. So the first thing would be the brutal thing is we'll just cut the curtain. So the curtain has a top that has some pre-colored stuff and a near top. And if we cut just below the near top, So we just basically separate into two parts, the part that is in the near top and the rest of it. Then what happens is, well, the curtain falls apart. Well, so we'll cut there, and a couple of things happen. It turns out that part near the top, if you think of what's in there, there was a handful of vortices. They all have small path width. There was a handful of major and minor apex vertices. That's just a bounded number of those things. There's another sort of neighboring layer, a BFS layer, but there's nothing in there that should have large tree width. Everything was small tree width. It's a small number of them. When you combine them, that's still small tree width. So that top part that we cut off, it's a small tree width graph. And the bottom part, well, the bottom part is a bunch of surface embedded things. And in fact, if we cut below the near top, actually, it's just individual surface embedded graphs. The curtain falls apart. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to color the top using H colors, and then we're just going to use completely 4 different colors to do each of these surface embedded things. So let's look at the bottom first. So we've cut off the top. We have this surface embedded thing, and Dvorak and Morin already proved that if you give me any graph embedded on a surface of Euler genus G, it has a 4 coloring with clustering that's bounded by a function of G. For us, G was a function of was less than L, and L was a function of H. So indeed, that's bounded by a function of H. And when we do this cutting, really this thing falls apart. So we just get a bunch of disjoint bounded genus graphs. We color each one of them individually using 4 colors. Okay, but that leaves us with the problem of coloring the top. Oh, and I should mention the 4 colors we're using are different from the colors we're going to use in the top, meaning they're different from the pre-colored vertices. So we're not going to have to worry about the pre-colored components bleeding down into the surfaces. They're just different colors entirely. Okay, so at the top we have a small tree width graph, and this thing, we haven't really done anything to our graph. It's still the same graph. Well, it's a subgraph now. So if our original graph was KH minor free, then this small tree width graph is also KH minor free. And something you can easily check is that if you're KH minor free, so meaning you don't have a complete graph on H vertices as a minor, then you don't have a complete bipartite graph with parts of size H minus 1 on each side as a minor. And that's easy to see. You just do take a matching from the left to the right that includes everything except for one vertex, and contract those matching edges, and you'll see that you get a KH when you do that. So KH minor free means KH minus 1, H minus 1 minor free. And now we're going to use a technique developed by Liu and Wood, who studied these bounded tree width clustered coloring problems. And there it says that if they have a graph with tree width at most K, and it happens to be KST subgraph free, for us, S is H minus 1 and T is also H minus 1, then that graph has an S plus 1 coloring. For us, that S plus 1 is H, with clustering at most some function of K, the tree width, and S and T, the sizes of these 2 things. And for us, all of those things are bounded by a function of H. Now, that would be, that sounds like we're done at this point. But remember, we have to make our coloring to be proper with respect to the pre-colored vertices. And this theorem doesn't say that, at least not as it is. And in fact, this theorem is something you have to extract from something that's stated in a way that's not very close to this at all. In fact, it's stated in terms of tangles. So I'll go quickly into the proof of this to see why it gives us all the things we want and why it can even give us more later. Okay, so their proof works like this. You assume that you are given, so you have S+1 colors available, your tree width is less than K, the graph has no KST for some largish value of T, and you're given a pre-colored set P of vertices. And this pre-colored set is not too big. If it were too big, there's nothing you could do. For instance, it could already be a large monochromatic component. There's no restriction on this set. So it's kind of not too big, or if it is too big, then they can't guarantee much. And then you break up the non-pre-colored vertices into basically three categories. They're the ones that have less than S neighbors that are pre-colored. They're the ones that have at least S neighbors that are pre-colored. And then there's the rest of them that have no pre-colored neighbors. So if you think about the ones that have less than S neighbors, that's this set Q in this picture. Well, originally that set Q, they could be colored with any of the S+1 colors. But we'll restrict them now and say, actually, if you find yourself in this set Q, you must be colored with a color that's not used by any of your pre-colored neighbors. So that means you still have two colors available, right? You have less than S pre-colored neighbors, so at most S-1, and you had S+1 colors. So you still have at least two colors available for the vertices in Q. The vertices in U, those are the ones with at least S pre-colored neighbors. We can't say anything about them. In particular, we won't be able to guarantee that they get a different color than all their pre-colored neighbors. They may have to take the same color as their pre-colored neighbor. But we'll say that if you end up in this set Q, you have at least two colors available to you at that time. And why? I mean, how would this happen? Well, it could be that, just before this, maybe you were in the set Q, you lost some colors, but then something else got colored. Now you end up in the set U, you have more than S pre-colored neighbors, but you still have two colors available to choose from. And then the rest of the vertices, they can have any one of the S+1 colors. Okay, and so the proof basically, or the lemma says that I will be able to give you an S+1 coloring. The clustering will be some function of K, the tree width, S and T, these two parameters of the graph, and the number of pre-colored vertices. Can't avoid that because they could already be a large cluster just by themselves. And a little bit more than that, the monochromatic components that intersect the pre-colored set, they will have total size that is related to the size of the pre-colored set. So if the pre-colored set is small, those monochromatic components that intersect it will also be small. But as it gets bigger, that guarantee gets less and less. And the proof basically has two cases. The first, so remember the two properties of this graph are bounded tree width and no KST. So here's where bounded tree width comes in. If the pre-colored set is big, like fairly big, in particular big compared to the tree width, then you have a tool that you can use with tree width is that you get separators. So if the tree width is at most K or less than K, then you have a separator of size K. And I don't mean a separator of the whole graph, I mean a separator of the pre-colored set. So with a separator of size K, you can break the pre-colored set up into two parts, each of which is at most 3/4 the original. And even more than that, if you pre-color the whole separator and count that now as pre-colored, they're still significantly smaller than the original pre-colored set. And once you do that, you recurse on one part, you get back what you want, you recurse on the other part, you get back what you want, and you can check that because the parts were substantially smaller and because of this guarantee about the size of the clusters that intersect the component having something to do with the size of that intersect the pre-colored set, having something to do with the size of the pre-colored set, when you combine these things, the clusters all have a reasonable size. And that's just because in each problem, the number of pre-colored vertices went down significantly. So you win in one of these standard divide and conquer recursions. So that's what happens when P is big. And when P is small is when the sort of clever, really clever thing happens. So you have so why can't you do this when P is small? Because if you try and do this when P is small, your separator can be bigger than the set. You're going to pre-color your separator. You just made a bigger pre-colored set. So that's sort of useless. So when P is small, you want to make it bigger for a while until it's big enough to use this separator strategy. So you imagine you have this small pre-colored set. You have this two types of neighbors, the few neighbors that are pre-colored, the ones with many neighbors that are pre-colored. The ones with many neighbors that are pre-colored, you're about to pre-color them now. Each of them has two colors available. You're going to pick one of those two colors and assign a color to it. So that's what happens here. But there was two colors available. How do you pick which one you're going to use? Well, I'll say that when I do this, I won't use color number 1. So the colors are 1 through S+1. Here, I won't use color number 1 the first time I do this. Okay. Now you have a bigger pre-colored set. You have some more things which are, some vertices are adjacent to a few things in this set. Some are adjacent to many. Well, the ones that are adjacent to many, you're going to color again. Each of those has at least two colors available. You will color those again, and you repeat this. But the next time you do it, the things you color, they're not going to avoid color 1. They're going to avoid color 2, and then the third time you do it, they'll avoid color 3, and so on. So by the end of this, you've done this for S+1 steps. You have probably a much larger pre-colored set. And so you got something bigger. But the nice thing about this is if you look at a component that started out in P0 in the original pre-colored set, it has some color C. That component may grow as you color more and more vertices. But when I get to PC, the Cth pre-colored set, I don't use color C anywhere in those things. And there are some other neighbors of that set which aren't pre-colored of set C-1, which aren't pre-colored right now, but those things were already going to avoid the colors of their pre-colored neighbors. So if you think about this for a few minutes, you'll realize that there's no edge of color C going from PC-1 to PC. So any component that started in this original pre-colored set will not extend to the outer one. Okay. All right. And I realized there was one thing that I forgot to mention. It's written right here. Of course, you don't want the pre-colored set to explode. You don't want to start with a small thing, take one step, and suddenly the whole graph needs to be pre-colored. That doesn't happen, and that's because of this KST minor free property. If we have an original pre-colored set P, everybody that we're going to color next has at least S neighbors in P. That's the definition of this set that we're going to color next. But if you have too many of those things, each with S neighbors in P, then, well, there's only size of P choose S ways to get those S neighbors. If you get too many of them, then a whole bunch of them will have picked the same set of S neighbors. In fact, T of them will have picked the same set of S neighbors, which is a KST subgraph, and those don't exist. So that's where the second property comes into play, to make sure that this pre-colored set never explodes. It always is related to the size of the original pre-colored set. Okay, so that's the idea of the proof. Those two things: bounded tree width and pre-colored sets never somehow explode in this way. And one thing that falls out of this is if the original pre-colored set has size less than S, well, then there was no set U. Nobody has more than S neighbors or S neighbors or more in the pre-colored set. And we already said that those guys will already be eventually receive a color which is different from their pre-colored neighbors.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So I don't get something conceptually here, which is for sure very easy. So so you split this into two cases, the explanation, and so if this set pre-colored set reaches some size, you're able to break it and call this induction.
Yeah.
Or and then and then if it's small, you're forced to grow, but you have control how fast it grows in a single step. So I don't conceptually understand, why do you actually need to prove that you break monochromatic components? Because if you control how it grows, then you know that at some point you will reach this moment that you can call induction, right? And then you can take a separator, and then you should be good. And in the meantime, it cannot grow too much because you have established a limit when you can call a separator. Something is off in my head, and I don't. Tell me.
So I'd have to think about. So I think something breaks there. And I mean, I think if you just unwind what happens, right? So in the step where we do the separator, we're not doing anything to say the coloring is proper in any way, in the sense that the monochromatic components grow into the left and into the right. So nothing is done to control that there. So
I know you have to keep this second invariant. So the one that your component actually monochromatic component doesn't grow too much with respect to the original one in the small step case. You didn't discuss it, but and this is the place you need the.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. So that's it. That's how you get H+4 colors. And so you may notice actually that that was already sort of the bottom of the list for that would be a great result now, but we can do better. And there was actually a proof of H color, so we want to get the right answer. But this gives you an idea that these curtains are already quite useful, even with rough techniques like this. Okay, so now we've seen another part of this thing, which is the U-Wood bounded tree width result and how it can be used. Okay, now the next part. Let's focus on, we want to do better. Let's not do something so rough as cutting up a curtain and destroying it like this. Let's look at, remember, a curtain is made up of many of these sheets. We call them drapes. What is one of these drapes? It's an almost embedded graph. It's got the major apices, it's got the vortices, and so on. This is where this notion of product structure comes in. So imagine that you take the vertices of the surface that are on the boundaries of the vortices, so the things that are touched by those clean disks, and you just take a BFS layering of this graph, starting with the first layer containing all of those vertices. So in particular, it's the graph minus the major apex vertices, because otherwise you might not get an interesting layering at all. So you take such a BFS layering. And all right, so that's, assigns a layer to each vertex depending on how far away it is from the vortices, at least in the surface. And now I will look, starting at layer 6 and on, I will partition the vertices into sets of so-called vertical paths.
Do you disregard the edges of the vortices here? Or?
We disregard the edges of the vortices. They're all up here in layer 1 anyway, so they don't help. They don't speed up the BFS at all.
There, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so from layer 6 on, we'll partition the vertices into vertical paths, vertical meaning at most one vertex in each BFS layer. And we'll do that in such a way that if we contract each of those paths, then what we get is a graph of bounded tree width. Okay, so I'm skipping over a bunch of things here, but this is basically what happens in this so-called product structure results. So that you partition into a bunch of vertical paths, you contract those paths, and the quotient graph that you get has small tree width. And the usual product structure results don't separate the first 5 layers from the rest. They would have paths going across all of those layers, but they still work if you separate the first 5 layers from the rest, and you still get bounded tree width just because a graph with only a few BFS layers doesn't have, or a bounded genus graph with a few BFS layers doesn't have large tree width anyway. Okay, so that's what happens. We take all of those layers 6 and on, partition them into paths, which we then contract, and then we call all of that layer star. So the layering is layers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then star. Okay, and I will draw that like this because it's a mess otherwise, and that is like a drape of a curtain that we have raised almost to the top. So this is a bounded tree width object now. And actually, that's what you do with just one drape of the larger curtain. But if you do that to every drape in a curtain, well, what's the relationship between those drapes? They're glued together on clique sums, on sort of cliques of bounded size. So that whole thing also has bounded tree width. So the whole raised curtain has bounded tree width. That means we can attack it with these bounded tree width results. So there's raising the curtain. Now you've seen that step. So let's do a second try, less colors still, and less brutal than destroying our curtain every time we do this. We raise the curtain. We take, for each drape in our curtain, we add an extra vertex which dominates everything on that bottom row. Okay, so that stuff that we raised up into this one messy row, this vertex dominates it. So we make a separate one for each drape. That's not strictly necessary right now, but let's just do that to make it cleanly. So adding those extra vertices doesn't really increase the tree width. You can check that fairly easily. The graph used to be KH minor free. With these extra vertices, we might have increased the size of the largest complete minor by 1, but at least it's still KH plus 1 minor free, which means that it's KHH minor free. That's this, right? The complete minor free implies the bipartite minor free that we discussed earlier. So with Liu and Wood, we can color this graph with H plus 1 colors. And in fact, we can ask for more. Not only will we color it with H plus 1 colors, but we'll insist that when I color the vertices in one of these layers, layer star, the rolled up layer, the one that really has probably most of the vertices in it, I will insist that each vertex there receives a color which is different from any of the major apices that it's adjacent to. So any of those H minus 5 major things, as well as different from that special vertex alpha that I introduced that dominates all of these things. So I won't go through the proof of why this works, but if you think about it, or how can you make this happen? Well, all you do is you do that Liu-Wood proof, but the moment that that proof tries to color something in layer 5, you immediately force it to color everything in the major apex set for that thing, if it's not colored already, and immediately force it to color this vertex alpha. Now, that's not a big deal. That's not a lot of extra vertices to color. So we're not going to blow up the size of the pre-colored set in a crazy way doing this. And now the other thing to check is these vertices in layer star. Well, if I haven't colored anything in layer 5 yet, these vertices are only adjacent to each other, things in layer 5 and things in the major apex set. But there's only H minus 5 things in the major apex set. So none of these things in layer star are going to be forced to receive a color before the first thing in layer 5. There's just not enough. You can't have enough pre-colored neighbors without some of them being in layer 5. So you do this carefully and you realize, I can set this up just perfectly so that these vertices do not receive colors of their major apex neighbors, nor this color of this alpha. And even alpha can be different than all the colors of the major apex vertices. Same proof, more details to check. Okay. All right. So that's, again, Liu-Wood again, enhanced. All right. And well, now that you've done that, you're happy. You colored this raised curtain. The coloring is proper with respect to these special alphas and with respect to the apex. Yeah.
So the major apices were for drapes or for curtains? For drapes,
Each drape has its own set of major apices.
And then you color the whole curtain, right?
So when yes, we're coloring the whole curtain, but when you touch, so layer 5 is different for each drape. They're completely disjoint.
Yeah.
They're only stapled in the first 2 layers. So all of those things are disjoint. When you touch layer 5, you just make sure that all of its major apices for that drape are pre-colored. And that special alpha thing is
somehow you have to be sure that your pre-colored set is somewhat, well, you lose control on the size if you suddenly put a major of one drape and second drape and third drape. No,
because when I hit layer 5, that's just, that's a vertex that only exists in one drape. Okay. And so if we already had this argument that said, well, as long as you only pre-color things that have more than S pre-colored neighbors, that doesn't blow up. So imagine there's the set that Liu would have colored. And then for each vertex in that set, maybe there's an additional h-5 that need to be colored. But coloring those doesn't force, I mean, that doesn't cascade because those don't live in the surface. They're up in the major, they're up in the tops. Okay. Now you unroll the curtains. Every vertex that was in that layer star was actually a long path of vertices that may have created a large monochromatic component if the path was very long. You're unhappy with that. At the end, you throw your tomatoes. For each one of those drapes, there's this color. Let's say this first drape, there's this color alpha 1, red, which was not used in any of those bottom layers. I mean, we made sure that all of the things in layer star didn't receive that color. So when we unroll the curtain, that color doesn't appear in any of those bottom layers. And now you just use that color to break those long components up. So you starting at layer 7, you say, well, let's take all of the purple paths and replace in layer 7, let's replace their purple vertices with red. And then in layer 9, let's take all the green paths and green vertices and replace them with red. And then layer 11, you do the purple vertices again. Round robin like this, and you break up each component into something of bounded size. Okay. Good. Okay, running really short on time. All right, so that's 4 of those steps. Let me just tell you where things get really hard. So here comes a problem, immediate. So we're going to try and extend this now. So we don't get H+1 colors, but we get H-1 colors. And if we think about how this is going to happen, what do we have available? We have H-1 colors available. H-5 of those might be used by major apices. And we're trying to reserve a color with this fake vertex. So that leaves us with 3 colors. So we have this whole graph on layer star, which is a rolled up version of pretty much everything that was in our surface. And we're going to try and color that with 3 colors. That might not be possible. So there are small tree width planar graphs with no clustered 3 coloring. Okay, so why is that not a deal breaker? Well, it's not a deal breaker because we don't have to guarantee that that the clustered that the components are small. We've already seen an example here. We were not able to guarantee that the components were small, but we were able to guarantee that they were skinny and that there was an extra color available to break them up. So that's what we're going to do to get around this. We're going to color this thing in such a way that maybe there are large components, but when we unroll them, they're all going to be skinny. Not just, maybe not, yeah, skinny. Okay, and then another way to view this difficulty comes this way. If you think about what can happen in a surface, you have H-5 major apices. In a surface embedded graph, you can have a large K2T, so a complete bipartite graph with 2 vertices on one side and T on the other. That happens even in planar graphs. And then you try and add this extra thing that dominates all of those, which means you have essentially, you can end up with a KH-2T, and T is unbounded. So that means it's not KH-2T minor free, which means that, well, we certainly won't be able to apply that tree width result as is. At best, we would get H colors that way. Okay, how do we solve that? So we use 3 islands. So there's an old result, well, not an old result, result of Dvorak and Morin that says in a surface embedded graph on bounded genus, you can find what's called a small 3 island. That's a set of vertices that if you look at for each vertex, it has at most 3 neighbors outside the set. 3 islands are awesome for 4 coloring, especially small ones, because you can just take them away, color the rest of the graph, put it back, and just make sure that each vertex receives a color that's different from its neighbors. That whole island may become a component, but if it was small, who cares? And none of the existing components bleeds into the island because it was colored properly. So that's what we'll do. And just very quickly, so these things always exist in surface embedded graphs, but even more, if you give me a set of vertices in a surface embedded graph and its neighborhood is not too big, then even within that set, I can find a 3 island. And with there's some restriction on the size, but it's reasonable. Okay, now we combine this with layered partitions, and here's what we can show. So remember, this is now this graph where we've partitioned into vertical paths. And imagine we take, let's say, 4 or some constant number of those vertical paths, and we remove them, and we're left with some component S. So one of 2 things happens. Either S has a 3 island in it, or every single layer that S intersects is small. This surprised us when we saw it. The proof is not hard. It just comes from the fact that if you have even one big layer, then, well, what are the neighbors of that big layer? It's the layer above, the layer below, and maybe 3 vertices on the edges of that layer. So if there's no 3 island in that set, that's because the layer above and or the layer below is considerably larger. But now you have those 2 consecutive layers, which are now much bigger than they were before. And why is there no 3 island there? Well, that's either because the layer above or the layer below is big, because there's certainly not many neighbors on the edge. There's only like, I don't know, 8 neighbors on the edge. And so actually, you quickly conclude that actually every layer has to be small, otherwise you end up with a 3 island. Okay. So for us, that means that when we raise our curtain, if we find, for instance, a separating 4 cycle in that layer star, then everything that's inside that 4 cycle unwinds into something that's skinny. So unravels into a thin thing. All right, and then the last step is on our surface, we look for many 4 cycles. So we call them 4 disks. So they're 4 cycles that actually slice off a disk from the surface. Anytime we find one of those things, we simplify what's inside of it, because we know that everything that's inside of it, no matter how complicated it is, will unwind to something skinny. So we get left with a constant number of vertices inside each thing. And something that you'll notice that our problem graph was K2Ts in our surface, but K2Ts are full of 4 cycles. And if you have a big K2T, actually, you're going to get a 4 cycle that has a large chunk in it. And doing this just right eliminates all the K2Ts. All right. So we kill off the K2Ts. Still not done. But I think that's as much as I will say. If there was no KH minus 2T in our whole graph, we would be done. We would just apply the Liu Wood result. What we know is we didn't create any new ones when we did this. Otherwise, there's another trick for dealing with those. It's a divide and conquer trick. Again, it says if there is a big KH minus 2T, the H minus 2 side is actually a good separator of the whole graph, and we can divide using that. Okay, that's it. That proves the clustered Hadwiger theorem. Same result also proves a bipartite version. So if you're KST minor free, you also have a clustered coloring with S+1 colors. And in the abstract, I promised a more general result. Both of these follow from basically a theorem about what we call JST minor free graphs. So JST is the set of all graphs you can make from a clique on S vertices and a tree on T vertices by joining them. And if you don't contain any of those as a minor, then you're S+1 colorable with some clustering that depends only on S and T. And that immediately implies the other two, if you think about it a bit. KH minus 2, complete summed with a single edge is a KH. So that's H minus 2 plus 1, that gives H minus 1 colors. And KST is indeed a subgraph of everything in JST. So that implies that other result. Okay, thank you.